Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's questions come from the True Stories collection, as in they actually happened at an event I was actually judging. First up, Nick plays a Blossombind against Amy's Gutsplitter gang. If Amy has no other creatures, must she lose 3 life to Gutsplitter gang's trigger? And the answer here is yes. If you are unable to put the required number of -1/-1 counters on a creature that you control, you cannot blight for that number. In general, anytime a resolving spell or ability offers you a choice, it isn't legal for a player to choose to do something that's illegal or impossible. Because Amy is unable to blight 2, she must lose 3 life. Be sure to read the cards very carefully though. Sometimes an option might look like it wouldn't be possible, but it actually is. For example, it is possible to blight 2 against a 1/1, even though you're blighting for more than its toughness. There's no problem with putting excess counters on because that's a legal and possible game action. Otherwise, cards like Black Sun Zenith would be much worse. In contrast, a Melora or a Solemnity would make it so their controllers would not be able to blight at all. Regarding Blossombind, one thing that can be a bit confusing is that this card specifically bars putting counters on the enchanted creature. This refers to the act of taking a counter and placing it on that creature, not the mere state of a counter existing on it. Effects like this were originally worded to say that counters couldn't be placed on that permanent, and I guess the current template is better, but it's still not perfect. Unfortunately, English doesn't really have a common word that applies to the former sense, but unambiguously doesn't apply to the latter. So until someone comes up with something better, we're stuck just knowing that Blossombind stops new counters from being added on, but it doesn't do anything about any counters that are already on the creature. Next question. Amy activates a Gristle Glutton, blighting a 1/1 while she controls Heirloom Auntie. Does she surveil before or after she discards and draws? Alright, the first thing that we'll need to know is that Gristle Glutton has an activated ability. Anything before the colon is part of the cost to activate this ability, and after Amy pays this cost, the ability goes onto the stack. During resolution, the effects of the ability, everything that happens after the colon, is going to occur. The next important fact that we'll need to answer this question is about how triggered abilities work. Heirloom Auntie's Surveil ability is a triggered ability, and to understand whether the surveil happens before or after the card draw, we'll need to know exactly how the game puts these abilities on the stack. So immediately after Amy taps Gristle Glutton and puts a -1/-1 counter on her creature, that ability is considered activated, and players will get a chance to respond to it. Before any player gets priority to cast a spell or activate an ability in response though, the game goes through a specific process. First, the game performs any applicable state-based actions. In the original problem statement, we said Amy was blighting a 1/1 creature, so this is the point where that creature dies for having 0 toughness. This causes Heirloom Auntie's ability to trigger. Putting triggered abilities onto the stack is the next step in the process, so the game does that for this ability. Note that it was put onto the stack with the Gristle Glutton ability already there. Accordingly, Heirloom Auntie's ability resolves first, answering the question from the original problem statement. Amy puts her 1/1 in the graveyard first, then surveils, then discards, and then draws. Let's close out this section with a challenge question to test your understanding. Amy sacrifices Ward-Eye Witch to activate Drown to Sulka. What is the correct order of sacrificing, discarding, drawing, and scrying? Well, first, let's observe that sacrifice a creature is part of the cost to activate Drown to Sulka, whereas discarding and drawing are part of the effects. Like before, paying the cost will cause Ward-Eye Witch's ability to trigger, and that trigger will go on the stack on top of Drown to Sulka's. Now, therefore, the proper order is to sacrifice first, then scry, then discard, then draw. For more practice with a similar scenario, I recommend my video about Bushmeat Poacher and Greedy Freebooter. Now, as you might have guessed based on the cards in these scenarios, this was indeed a limited event. Specifically, it was a sealed RCQ. I found that these have a few complications that tend to come up when running them compared to constructed RCQs or other sealed events such as pre-releases. So let's go through a few of the ones that came up for me on that day and see how these issues are handled at competitive rel. The first one was a player calling a judge during opening and stating that his pack didn't have a rare in it. Sure enough, when I looked at it, there were 14 cards and no rares and mythics. Now, under normal circumstances, I would have questioned whether this player might have moved the rare from the pack into his deck box, but this is competitive rel sealed, which means that there was another player who witnessed opening this pack, and he confirmed there was no rare. If you're interested in this process, I made a whole video about how to run an RCQ where I went over how it works in detail, but for now, I'll just take it as a fact that the pack really had an incorrect set of cards in it. I guess there's still a possibility that maybe these two players knew each other and they cooked up a plot to mulligan one of their packs or something, but as a judge at a certain point, you need to trust in the processes and focus on doing your best with the situations that you catch, rather than trying to catch everything, which is never going to be possible anyway. So what's the appropriate response for a case like this? Well, it turns out there actually is an official policy, and it says the head judge must decide whether to replace the pack or allow the player to use the cards as opened in conjunction with the tournament organizer. We determined that replacing the pack was clearly the better option in this case, so that's what we did. This same philosophy would also apply in cases where a player opens cards from another set in their sealed product, which for some reason was a really popular question among players in the event after I resolved this situation. Now, next up, how about some questions from the top 8 draft? The first one that came up is how double-face cards work. Even though they've been part of the game since 2011 and a deciduous mechanic, which means they can show up in any set, since 2017, drafting at competitive rel is a rather infrequent occurrence for most players, so it's natural to have a few questions pop up about how to handle them, since double-faced cards break one of the fundamental rules of drafting: thou shalt not look at thy neighbor's picks. If a card doesn't have a normal magic back, it becomes impractical to try to conceal its identity the way that you're normally supposed to. Another thing that compounds this confusion is the lack of a consistent policy from Wizards. Here is the only guidance that we have from any written policy document. You can see that players may reveal both sides of a DFC at any point during a draft. While this policy has been the same since DFCs were introduced, its implementation has not, even at the highest levels of play. In the first set with DFCs, these cards were on their own separate print sheet, and thus each pack had one. In the Pro Tour that drafted Innistrad, this was handled by having each player hold up the DFC from their pack for a few seconds after they opened. In later PTs, where there weren't double-faced cards in every pack, the head judge generally specified publicly declaring your pick anytime a player drafted a DFC as the norm. When DFCs came back as a major block mechanic and reassumed their 1 per pack status in PT Shadows over Innistrad, Wizards was concerned about giving players equal access to this public information and made the decision to sleeve all of the cards in the Pro Tour drafts, confounding players who had assumed that they would continue having this information at their disposal. So, what's the correct procedure? Well, officially, anything that complies with that one line of guidance we have is acceptable. Players are allowed to reveal any DFC that they draft to the rest of the table, but they may choose not to. In the case where a player wants to attempt to conceal the identity of any DFC, they're responsible for making reasonable efforts to keep it hidden. In practice, this is unlikely to come up since, in contrast to revealing cards during gameplay, it's generally beneficial to reveal information about what cards you're taking or passing during a draft. This allows other players at the table to read a clear signal regarding what color or colors that the player is interested in, likely improving the quality of their deck. Finally, here's one last scenario. Amy is drafting, and while deciding what card to pick during pack 1, she sets the cards from that pack down, picks up the cards that she has already drafted to check what she already has, and then she sets these back down and drafts a card. What do you do? Alright, so first up, what Amy did is illegal. At regular rel, players can review their picks at any time so long as they're careful to keep the cards in the pack clearly separate. At competitive rel, this is not allowed. All the picks must remain face down and cannot be reviewed outside of the designated review periods that take place between packs. Based on Amy's reaction when I confronted her about this, she was definitely not aware of this distinction, but that doesn't mean what she did was okay. This fits the definition for an infraction called limited procedure violation, which is the general infraction given anytime a player makes a technical mistake in a draft. The normal penalty here is a warning, but there's no fix prescribed, and I'm not really sure what fix we could even perform that would undo the illegal action Amy took and restore the state of the draft to what it was before. That doesn't mean Amy's getting off scot-free though. Limited procedure violation is categorized as a tournament error, and such violations have their penalty upgraded to a game loss on the second and subsequent offenses. This is true even if later ones are committed in a different way. For example, LPV is also the appropriate infraction for cases where a player moves their head in a suspicious manner, or changes their mind about drafting a card and tries to move it back into the pack to take a different one. If Amy gets another LPV in this draft for any reason, that would be grounds to assess a game loss for her in the first match of her top 8. Needless to say, Amy was very cautious for the remainder of the draft. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? I hope you had fun going through my tournament from the last weekend. Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.